Have you ever looked at someone you once admired, a teacher, a friend, maybe even a parent, and suddenly realized they're not who you thought they were? That the person who once embodied kindness, integrity, and compassion has become distant, cold, even cruel? You pause. You wonder. What happened to them? How could someone like that become this? Now take a step further. Ask yourself, could that ever be me? This isn't just a dramatic question for a movie plot or a psychological thriller. It's a question rooted in something very real, very uncomfortable, and very human. In this video, we're going to dive deep into a dark but crucial question. Why do good people turn into monsters? And the truth is, the answer isn't just about them. It's about all of us. Because the line between good and evil isn't as thick as we'd like to believe. It's not a wall, it's a thread. And that thread runs right through the center of every human heart. What you're about to hear may challenge everything you think you know about morality, character, and human nature. We'll explore real-world psychological experiments, disturbing moments in history, and the hidden mechanisms that influence us every day, often without our awareness. You'll learn why people obey orders even when it hurts others, why we stop seeing others as people, why silence becomes complicity, and how the smallest compromise can become the first step on a very dark path. But most importantly, you'll learn how to resist it. Because while we all carry the potential for harm, we also carry the power to choose differently. This is not just a story of bad people. It's a mirror. And when you look into it, ask yourself, who do I become when no one is watching? Stay with me, because what you're about to discover won't just change the way you see others. It might just change the way you see yourself. In 1971, in the basement of Stanford University, a group of young, healthy, well-adjusted college students became something none of them expected. They became either prisoners or guards. It was part of a psychological experiment led by Professor Philip Zimbardo, an attempt to explore how people respond to roles of power and submission when placed in a simulated prison environment. The setup was simple. 24 volunteers split randomly into two groups. The guards were told to maintain order. The prisoners, to obey. There were no real crimes, no real criminals, no real stakes. And yet, within just 6 days, less than a week, what unfolded was nothing short of disturbing. The guards, once friendly students, began to humiliate the prisoners. They denied them sleep, forced them to do meaningless, degrading tasks. They became aggressive, and in some cases, even sadistic. Meanwhile, the prisoners, also just students, began to break down emotionally. They lost their sense of identity. Some cried, others collapsed. One even had to be removed due to psychological distress. The experiment had to be shut down early. Why? Because the illusion had become reality. The roles had consumed the people playing them. And this is what Zimbardo would later call the Lucifer Effect. It's the idea that ordinary, good people can commit terrible acts, not because they are evil at heart, but because the situation around them allows it, even encourages it. You see, we like to think that goodness is a fixed trait, that people are either good or bad. But Zimbardo showed us something much scarier. It's not who you are, it's where you are, and who you become when the environment shifts. Give someone power, strip someone else of their dignity, add a uniform, a label, and just a little silence from those who could object, and you'll be shocked at what unfolds. The truth is, monsters aren't born. They're made, and they're often made not in darkness, but in daylight, in schools, in offices, in homes, in any place where power goes unchecked and empathy is forgotten. So ask yourself, what role have you been assigned in life? And are you really in control of how it's shaping you? Because the Lucifer Effect is not just a theory. It's a warning. In the early 1960s, Yale University psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted a study that would shock, quite literally, the world. The experiment was simple, yet diabolically revealing. Volunteers were told they were part of a learning experiment. Their role? To deliver electric shocks to a learner whenever that person gave a wrong answer. Each time, the shock increased in intensity. The learner, of course, was an actor. The shocks weren't real. But the reactions? Those were very real. As the learner screamed, pleaded, even begged for the experiment to stop, the volunteers were urged by a calm man in a white lab coat to please continue. And they did, despite visible distress, despite hearing cries of pain, despite believing they were seriously harming another human being. Over 65% of participants continued to the highest voltage level, 450 volts, simply because someone in authority told them to. Let that sink in. These were not sadists. They weren't criminals. They were teachers, fathers, secretaries, regular people. And yet, in the presence of authority, their moral compass bent, until it nearly disappeared. Why? Because we are conditioned to obey. From childhood, we learn to follow orders, from teachers, bosses, doctors, governments. And most of the time, that's a good thing. Society functions because we cooperate, we listen, we follow structure. But what happens when authority is misused? What happens when someone in power tells you to do something wrong, and you feel too small to say no? That's where the real danger lies. Milgram's experiment wasn't just about fake shocks. It was a mirror, held up to every workplace, every military unit, every relationship where power goes unchallenged. And the most disturbing part? Most participants later said they knew it felt wrong, but they went on anyway, because the voice in the white coat sounded certain, because they didn't want to be responsible for breaking the rules, because they thought, someone else will stop it. But here's the truth. If you don't question unjust authority, who will? If you obey without thinking, what are you capable of? And what if one day, the person giving orders isn't a scientist, but a leader, a boss, a political figure? Would you still obey? Would you harm others just because you were told to? The Milgram experiment doesn't ask you to judge. It dares you to reflect. Imagine this. You're asked to hurt someone, but you don't see their face. You don't hear their voice. You only see a label: criminal, or enemy, or them. Would it be easier? Throughout history, the answer has often been yes. One of the most powerful and dangerous forces that turns good people into perpetrators of cruelty is dehumanization. When we strip someone of their humanity, when we no longer see them as a mother, a brother, a child, or a friend, but only as a category, a label, or worse, a threat, we create the psychological distance needed to justify harm. It starts subtly. We use words like those people, scum, rats, or parasites. We stop using names. We replace human stories with statistics. We stop listening. And before long, it's not just easier to ignore their suffering. It becomes easy to participate in it. This tactic has been used time and again in genocides, wars, and mass violence. Think about it. The Holocaust didn't begin with gas chambers. It began with propaganda. Cartoons depicting Jews as rats, posters equating them to disease. The Rwandan genocide? It began with radio broadcasts calling the Tutsi cockroaches. In Vietnam, American soldiers were trained to refer to the Vietnamese as gooks, a slur that reduced the enemy to something less than human. Because it's easier to kill an animal than a person, easier to cage a number than a name, easier to hate a faceless group than an individual with hopes, dreams, and a family. But dehumanization isn't only a thing of the past. Look around. In today's world, we still see it. On social media, in politics, in the way we talk about immigrants, addicts, the homeless, or people from the other side. When we say they deserve it, or they're not like us, or why should I care? We begin to chip away at our own empathy. And empathy, once lost, opens the door to silence, to cruelty, to evil. So ask yourself, how do you speak about those you disagree with? Do you see their humanity, or only their label? Because the moment we stop seeing each other as people, we give ourselves permission to become something less than human too. And that's where monsters are born, not with a roar, but with indifference. Think about this. Are you really yourself? Or are you the version of you that the world expects? At work, you're the professional. At home, the parent. Among friends, the funny one. Online, maybe the activist. Or the bystander. The truth is, we all play roles. And that in itself isn't wrong. Society needs structure. We can't function without some shared understanding of who does what. But what happens when those roles become more than costumes? What happens when they begin to define what we allow ourselves to do? In the infamous Stanford Prison Experiment, which we mentioned earlier, it wasn't just about cruelty. It was about conformity to role. Ordinary students became abusive guards not because they were evil, but because the role of guard required them to act tough, dominant, even cruel. And the students playing prisoners, they internalized submission. They broke. They became their role, all in just a few days. This wasn't fiction. This was real. And it shows us something terrifying. Our identity is more fragile than we think. You see, the moment we slip into a role, especially one defined by hierarchy, power, or obedience, we begin to adjust our behavior to fit that role. We rationalize. We mirror others. We silence the part of us that says, "This isn't right." Not because we're monsters, but because we want to belong, to be effective, to not disrupt the script. This happens in corporations where managers ignore unethical practices, in classrooms where bullies dominate while teachers look the other way, even in families where generational patterns of silence and control are passed down like heirlooms. And often, the phrase that comes up is, "That's just the way things are." But is it? Or are we simply too comfortable, too afraid, or too conditioned to question the role we've been cast in? Here's the uncomfortable truth. You can be a good person and still play a destructive role. Because goodness isn't just about intention, it's about action, and the courage to reject roles that harm, even when they're popular, profitable, or praised. So ask yourself, what roles do I play every day? Who benefits from me staying in them? And what would happen if I stepped out? Because sometimes, being the villain doesn't mean growing horns. It simply means saying nothing when the script tells you to act. Evil doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't arrive with flames, pitchforks, or a sinister grin. No, sometimes, evil begins with a whisper, a shrug, a decision that seems harmless. Just this once, you see a colleague being bullied, but you say nothing. You hear a lie being told, but you let it pass. You're told to follow a rule that doesn't feel right, but you obey anyway. Why? Because it's easier. Because it's not your business. Because it's only a small compromise. But here's the truth no one wants to admit. Every monster once said, "Just this once." The most dangerous part of moral failure is not how fast it happens. It's how slowly it begins. Psychologists call this the slippery slope. It's a process, not a moment. You take one step away from your values, then another, and another. Each time, your guilt fades just a little. Your conscience adjusts. You start to rationalize. I didn't have a choice. It's not that bad. Everyone else is doing it. And before long, the line you swore you'd never cross is behind you, far behind you. You didn't leap across it. You drifted. This is how otherwise good people become enablers. How silence turns into complicity. How small lies build into systems of harm. History is full of examples. People who handed over neighbors to dictatorships, who participated in broken systems because they had families to feed, who followed orders because it wasn't their job to question. But here's the chilling truth. They didn't become villains overnight. They became villains one quiet moment at a time. And this leads us to a haunting question. When was the last time you stayed silent? When was the last time you went along, just to keep the peace? No one is asking you to be perfect. But what makes the difference? What stops the drift? Is awareness. That moment you pause and ask, is this who I want to be? Because yes, monsters are real, but they don't always wear masks. Sometimes they wear your face. In a moment when you forgot who you are and chose what was easy over what was right. We like to believe there are two kinds of people in the world, the good and the bad, the heroes and the villains, the ones who would never harm, and the ones who were born broken. It's comforting to think that way. Simple, clear, safe. But what if the truth is far more complicated? What if the line between good and evil isn't out there, but in here, inside you? Psychiatrist Carl Jung called it the shadow, the parts of ourselves we deny, the urges, the thoughts, the instincts that don't fit the version of who we want to be. Envy, hatred, rage, cruelty. They don't vanish just because we pretend they're not there. In fact, the more we repress them, the more they grow in the dark, shapeless, hungry, waiting for a moment of weakness to break through. You felt it. The sudden flash of anger that scared you. The jealous thought you never said aloud. The small, bitter part of you that enjoyed someone else's failure. That's the shadow speaking, and acknowledging it doesn't make you a monster. Denying it might, because when we believe we're incapable of darkness, we stop watching for it. We let it operate behind the curtain, unchecked and unexamined. That's when it slips into our choices, into the words we use, the power we abuse, the people we hurt without realizing why. But here's the most important part. The shadow isn't something to destroy. It's something to understand. Jung believed that only by confronting our darkness can we become whole. Not by acting on it, but by recognizing it, by making it conscious. Why? Because what we don't own owns us. We are not either good or evil. We are both. We are capable of unimaginable compassion and unthinkable cruelty. And the only thing that decides which part of us takes control is whether we are aware enough, brave enough, to face the truth of who we are. So ask yourself, when was the last time you looked inward and saw the shadow staring back? Because until you do, you'll never know who's really making your choices. We like to think of ourselves as rational, moral beings. We believe we know right from wrong. That if faced with a clear moral choice, we choose what's just, what's kind, what's good. But what happens when doing the right thing feels inconvenient, embarrassing, dangerous? That's when another part of the human mind awakens. The part that rationalizes, that creates stories to protect our self-image, even when we're in the middle of betraying our own values. Psychologist Albert Bandura called this process moral disengagement. It's the ability to disconnect our actions from our conscience, to commit harm without feeling like we're the villain. And it happens more often than you think. A student cheats on an exam and says, everyone else is doing it. A manager cuts corners and thinks, it's just business. A police officer uses excessive force and says, they deserved it. In every case, the same mechanism is at work. We rewrite the narrative to protect our image of ourselves as good people. We shift blame. We minimize harm. We call it a gray area. We say, they made me do it. Or, I had no choice. We distance ourselves from the consequences, emotionally, psychologically, so we don't have to feel the weight of what we've done. And the scary part? It works. We sleep at night. We keep smiling in the mirror. We carry on. But just because we don't feel guilty doesn't mean we're innocent. Moral disengagement is like a dimmer switch for empathy. Each time we use it, the light inside grows a little fainter. And over time, we stop recognizing ourselves in the darkness. So how do we fight back? With something called moral vigilance. It's the conscious habit of asking, am I justifying something I know is wrong? Would I be okay if this were done to me? What story am I telling myself? And who does it protect? It's uncomfortable, but it's necessary, because your brain will always try to protect your ego. But your soul? It's asking for something deeper. Integrity. And that starts when you stop making excuses and start telling the truth. Not to the world, but to yourself. So far, we've explored the darkest corners of the human mind. We've seen how authority, roles, dehumanization, and self-deception can turn good people into agents of harm. We've looked inward and found the shadow. Now the question is, what next? How do we stop ourselves from crossing the line? How do we protect our humanity when everything around us seems to strip it away? The answer, like the problem, begins inside. The first and most vital ingredient is something called moral courage. Not physical bravery, not bold speeches or grand gestures, but the quiet, uncomfortable act of choosing what's right, even when it costs you. It's saying no when your boss asks you to lie. It's standing up for someone being mistreated, even when no one else will. It's admitting your mistake before you're caught, because it's the right thing to do. But moral courage isn't something you're born with. It's something you build through practice. One way to start is by identifying your core values. What matters most to you? Honesty? Compassion? Fairness? Responsibility? Then ask, do my daily actions reflect those values? Another powerful tool is empathy. Not just feeling bad for someone, but truly putting yourself in their place. What would this feel like if it were happening to me? What if it were my child, my friend, my parent? Empathy collapses the walls of dehumanization. It reminds us, we are all more alike than we are different. But even empathy and courage aren't enough if we live in environments that reward silence, reward cruelty, reward conformity. That's why we must also build what psychologists call situational awareness. Be conscious of the systems you are part of. Ask yourself, what behaviors are being encouraged here? What's going unspoken? Am I participating in something harmful just by going along? Sometimes, resistance doesn't look like protest. It looks like small, quiet acts. White heavy check mark asking a hard question in a meeting. White heavy check mark refusing to laugh at a cruel joke. White heavy check mark choosing not to repost that hateful comment. Each of those choices matters, because the same way evil grows, bit by bit, act by act, so does integrity. You don't need to be a hero. You just need to be awake. Because the opposite of evil is not innocence. It's consciousness. It's refusing to sleepwalk into someone else's script. It's choosing, over and over again, to be someone you can live with. What if I told you, you don't need to be a superhero to save the world? That courage isn't reserved for soldiers, martyrs, or icons. That heroism doesn't always look like standing on a podium. Sometimes, it looks like standing alone. Psychologist Philip Zimbardo, the same mind behind the Stanford Prison Experiment, introduced another concept to balance the darkness he uncovered. He called it the heroic imagination. It's the belief that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary moral courage, if they are mentally prepared to recognize the moment when it matters most. Because moments of truth don't come with fireworks. They don't announce themselves. They show up quietly, when no one is watching, when the stakes feel unclear, when it's easier to look away. And in those moments, people either say, "It's not my problem," or they say, "I can't ignore this." The difference? Heroic imagination. It's a mindset, one that you can train. It starts by asking simple, powerful questions. What would I do if I saw someone being mistreated? What if I was the only one who noticed something was wrong? Am I willing to act, even if no one thanks me for it? And then you rehearse your answer, not just in your mind, but in real life, through small daily acts of resistance. White heavy checkmark defending someone being talked down to. White heavy checkmark calling out a cruel comment, even among friends. White heavy checkmark admitting when you're wrong and choosing to make it right. These moments might feel small, but they are the reps that build moral muscle. And here's the best part. Heroism is contagious. When one person speaks up, others feel permission to do the same. When one person stands firm, others find their backbone. One quiet act of integrity can echo louder than 1,000 words. So if you're thinking, "Who am I to make a difference?" remember this. You're someone who sees. You're someone who thinks. And now, you're someone who knows. That's already more than most. So the next time life gives you a choice, to speak or stay silent, to act or walk away, remember, the world doesn't need more perfect people. It needs awake people. People with vision. People with imagination. Heroic imagination. And you already have it. At this point in our journey, you may be wondering, is there any way to win this battle? The battle within? We've explored how power corrupts, how roles consume, how silence enables, and how the shadow within each of us waits for its moment. We've seen how the path to cruelty is paved not with hatred, but with justification, conformity, and fear. But here's the truth most forget. Just as these forces can lead us astray, they can also lead us back. Because we are not doomed to become monsters. We are not helpless in the face of darkness. We are choosing every single day, in the quiet moments, in the conversations no one hears, in the split-second decisions when no one's watching. That's where the real battle is fought. As writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn once said, the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. It doesn't run between nations, or religions, or political parties. It runs through you. And that's not a curse, it's a gift. Because it means that no matter who you've been, you still get to choose who you become. You are not the worst thing you've ever done, but you are responsible for what you do next. And that's where the power lies. In each moment, you have the opportunity to white heavy checkmark listen instead of judging. White heavy checkmark speak up instead of staying silent. White heavy checkmark care instead of turning away. You have the power to break cycles, to unlearn hate, to choose kindness in a world that often rewards cruelty. You may not always get it right. You will fall. You will fail. But you can begin again. And that is what separates the truly good from the blindly obedient. Not perfection, but awareness. Not comfort, but courage. So now I leave you with one question. When the moment comes, and it will you be ready to choose? Because monsters are not born. They are made when we stop choosing. And heroes? They are also made. Not in glory, not in fame, but in the simple, radical decision to do what's right. Even when it's hard, the world doesn't need more monsters. It needs you. Thank you for following along. If this video made you think, feel, or reflect, leave a comment below. What do you think turns a good person into a monster? And what keeps us on the side of the light?